David, and thank you all very much for coming out tonight with the rain coming down. It's very good of you to endure the elements. I very nearly didn't come myself, so I'm glad to see you all here. And it is a pleasure to introduce Mike Fletcher, who, as well as being the National Economics Correspondent at the Washington Post these days, also had a stint as White House Correspondent. So we're going to be able to kick around a lot of issues relating to the current election cycle, the current economic climate in the United States, and also some media issues and how that is likely to play out this year in particular, and some of the broader media issues. Newspapers going to be around in the next few years, all that kind of stuff as well. And there'll be lots of time for you all to ask questions, and I really do encourage you to do so, because often for sort of jaded media types like Mike and I, you get much better questions from...
Hello.
Yes. You were so polite, you should have said, I can't hear you! So it's going to be plenty of time for you all to ask a question later on as well. But let's start, Mike. We had a recall election in Wisconsin today, and the polls were generally indicating that Republican Governor Scott Walker was going to win it, and indeed he did, by about 7%. Sarah Palin got on Fox News and said, Barack Obama's goose is cooked. Are there national implications? Has Obama's goose been cooked today in Wisconsin?
Well, to put it bluntly, no. not by this, but it's not a good thing either for Barack Obama to see this kind of result. I think this is a big loss for organized labor in the United States, which is a very influential constituency. Not many Americans are members of labor unions anymore. Roughly, I think, 11 or 12%. Not even that many, it's I think about 10%, 11, and 37% of public employees are members of unions, and roughly 7% of people who work for private companies are unionized. So this is a small slice of people, but they have disproportionate impact in the Democratic Party. And I think Barack Obama would never be, is not happy to see them lose. But at the same time, Barack Obama stayed far away from this election. All he did to signal support was send a tweet the day before. He never went to Wisconsin to campaign against Scott Walker, even though Scott Walker stands for many things that Barack Obama stands against.
Was that just overestimating the power of social media? One tweet wouldn't win a recall election, or
what's called political caution.
Right.
He didn't want to be associated with a defeat. I think they saw that it was a close race all along, and in the last couple of weeks, Scott Walker was breaking away in the polls. So I think the White House was prepared for it.
In order to have this recall election, they got a petition with about 900,000 signatures on it. In the end, they got about 200,000 or 300,000 more people to vote for Tom Barrett today. What does that say about this storied Democrat get out the vote, social media, kind of grassroots machine that propelled Obama to the presidency?
I mean, there's some parallels to even, when someone's friends you on Facebook. It's pretty easy to sign a petition. And sometimes you'll sign a petition not knowing exactly what you're signing. I think you might have had some of that there, perhaps. And it's interesting to look at some of the exit polls. Roughly 38% of union households had people who voted against the union side of this. They voted to retain Scott Walker in office, so that tells you something. Roughly 1 in 5 of the votes, 1 in 5 Obama supporters voted to retain Scott Walker. So you get a lot of crossing over in these kinds of things.
And on a national level, Obama won Wisconsin by 14% in 2008. But according to exit polls today, they've come into a bit of question, Obama is still comfortably in front of Mitt Romney.
In Wisconsin, yeah. And Wisconsin pretty much is a Democratic state when it comes to presidential elections these days. I think every election since 1988 has been won by the Democrat in Wisconsin, even though Wisconsin votes for many Republicans for governor and other offices. So it's kind of interesting kind of dichotomy in that state in terms of electoral behavior.
Okay, so if Wisconsin isn't necessarily an issue in November, the economy certainly is. Last Friday, the jobs data for the month of May ticked up from April 1 to 8.2%. Statistically, it gets tried out time and again, but it is telling that since the Second World War, no president has been re-elected with unemployment over 7.4%. If it's got an 8 in front of it, not a 7, is Obama's goose cooked again?
It's interesting, but that theory has only been put to the test once. I think it was Ronald Reagan who was elected with that unemployment rate back in 1984. So it's hard to know, if there's an absolute level that kind of excludes someone from reaching re-election, but certainly it's not a good thing that the unemployment rate is drifting up as we move closer to the election. It's not a good thing for Barack Obama. Perhaps it's good for Mitt Romney. I think the American people respond to the sense of momentum, the trajectory of the economy, and right now it's not good. Back in the winter, the American economy is creating many more jobs, roughly 250,000 a month for a few months, and it was good news. The Obama people were optimistic. You get all kinds of off-the-record comments about how, Romney will never touch them. But once again, for the third year in a row, the economy is kind of stalled as we reach summer. So I think that's a real worry. And I think for Obama, it's not the absolute level, but it's the direction of the economy, and particularly the job market as we get closer to Election Day.
Explain to us the mood in the United States and how that relates to the economic cycle, because on paper, this recession ended 3 years ago this month. And yet, for most Americans that have got a mortgage that's bigger than what their house is worth, and they're worried about their jobs and so on, it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah, you're right, and that's a really big problem. You tell the average American that the recession ended in June 2009, and they'll ask you what you're smoking, because they don't feel that in their lives. At least most people don't, because as you point out, many people are underwater with their homes, and the homes in America, I would assume here in Australia too, are the biggest source of wealth for the average, the average person, the average voter. So if you've seen, that kind of thing go away, you're anxious.
One of the things that I guess Barack Obama expended the most political capital on was healthcare reform. The Affordable Care Act is currently before the Supreme Court of the United States. We expect in the next 2 or 3 weeks they're going to rule on its constitutionality. The tea leaves seem to be, and who knows how accurate this is, people say, Justice Kennedy was looking at this, he knows what it said. But some of it could be choked out. Maybe the individual mandate could be thrown out. What implications does that have?
I think they're huge. The individual mandate is the provision in the law that requires everyone to buy health insurance, every adult to buy health insurance. And that's something that is probably the most controversial part of the bill. Because Americans, we have this kind of maverick frontier, sort of individual spirit. We believe in liberty, and the government shouldn't tell us what to buy and what not to buy. So that's kind of the heart of the law, and it's the thing that makes the bill work economically. If you can have subsidies for people to buy health insurance, you have to have, if you can insure the sickest people, and anyone who does any kind of actuarial work knows that you have to have healthy people in the pool along with sick people to make the thing work economically. Otherwise, premiums will go through the roof. So if that goes away, it feels to me like you kind of unravel the law. But interestingly, and I think this speaks to kind of the pessimism the White House feels, they're floating ideas now saying that perhaps the law can work without the individual mandate. But that seems to me you'd have to strip away the most popular parts of the bill if you do that. One of them being that insurance companies can't, turn down people who have pre-existing medical conditions. So I think this is a huge thing. This is, Barack Obama's, I think, arguably his biggest achievement in his first term. And already, politically, it's not really a winner for him because he doesn't talk about it much. The American public hasn't embraced the law. And I think largely because the American public doesn't understand the law. It's interesting, we've seen poll after poll that sort of asks Americans, well, what do you think of, what's become known as Obamacare? And people are skeptical about it. But if you ask people about the component parts of Obamacare, the provision that say, you can keep your children on your health insurance until they're age 26. People say, I like that. Mm-hmm. People say, you ask people, should insurance companies be able to not sell insurance to people with pre-existing medical conditions? They say, no, that sounds unfair. I like that. You say, well, that's in the law. and people actually are surprised by that.
In a way, it almost seems as though the first battle was lost when it got known as Obamacare. In this country, when the government put a price on carbon, as soon as it became a carbon tax rather than a price on carbon, it kind of lost that argument.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly enough, the White House now says Obamacare. They started out as kind of a slur.
Yeah. So for Mitt Romney, he's sort of treading an interesting line on this because Democrats will say, gee, Mitt Romney's reforms in Massachusetts, they were a template for Obamacare. A lot of the people who were involved in designing that for Romney were consulted on the Affordable Care Act. Is it going to be an asset for him? Is he going to be able to win an argument if this does become the big issue at the end of the month?
You mean Romney wins?
Yeah.
I don't think this is going to become the argument. That's the thing. Because Romney has kind of walked a perilous line on this, if you ask me. He sort of said, well, healthcare reform, this bill is good for Massachusetts, but it's not good for America. So, why is that the case? But the thing is, who's going to pick that argument with him? I think it was a real battle for him in the Republican primary campaign, but President Obama doesn't really want to. you kind of argue about this with him. So I think it's something that might allow him to slide under the radar. It's been so interesting. So Romney has kind of moved very far on many issues. I was reading either today or yesterday about his position on the auto bailouts. You know, the government bailed out both General Motors and Chrysler in the United States, and Romney was very critical of this. And Romney is originally from Michigan, which is kind of the hub of auto manufacturing in the United States. And he spoke out against this, turned out to be very unpopular. And now, I read where Romney said he actually thought the bailouts were a good idea, but you had to have a managed, he had a nuance, you had to have a managed bankruptcy first. So he's interesting. He's kind of relatively, like, perhaps more than most politicians, shameless and sort of playing both sides of the fence.
Yeah, some would say that the Bain capital way is that they lose their entitlements as well, when you say the people. But, on that Bain capital attack, and this is something that I guess Obama is having to tread a delicate line because he's still taking campaign contributions from people with Bain capital. He got a lot of money from Wall Street last time around, not nearly as much this time around, funnily enough. Is that their only point of attack on Romney, Bain capital, vulture capitalism?
I mean, that's, for now, they want to frame, I think they're worried about this image of Romney as a businessman and a guy who implicitly understands the economy, kind of instinctively understands how business works in a way that Barack Obama doesn't. So you want to frame him as a guy who's basically one of the guys who helped take down the economy in many ways, one of the guys who's responsible for you losing your job, the guy who's squeezing new efficiencies out of the economy in a way that hurts working people. That's the frame they want to put around Mitt Romney, because I think there's a threat there. If the economy continues to stall and we get closer to November, I think a guy who has kind of the business credential starts looking a lot better. He looks a lot safer, and I think the Obama forces want to forestall that.
A lot of comparisons have been made, negative comparisons between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter, and is this a 1980 election done over again? Do you see in Mitt Romney the potential to, if not be the same sort of charismatic communicator that Ronald Reagan was, to be the kind of candidate who is the subject of a scare campaign for a long time, but then can break late and reassure people at the right time that he actually is somebody who can trust?
I'll have to wait and see that. It's hard to tell. I mean, he seems to have some of the same political weaknesses that Barack Obama has, interestingly enough. Barack Obama is this charismatic figure, a guy who's able to sort of rouse people and move people, but he doesn't really like applying those talents politically. Somehow he's a very talented politician who, in many ways, doesn't like politics. He doesn't like kind of the silliness of it, you know, the kind of the symbolic gesture and things like that. So I don't think he really rouses people I mean, he rouses them on one level, but not on another level. And Mitt Romney also is kind of a bit of a cold fish. You know, Obama has this aloofness, and I think Romney does as well.
Let's talk about some of the other issues that are likely to be at play this year. It surprised a few people that a month or so back, Barack Obama came out and said that he personally supports same-sex marriage. And it came out in such a way that people weren't sure, was that Biden making a gaffe, and they just thought, oh, we've got to bring this issue to a head now and, you know, trust that Romney doesn't really want social issues to be part of the fall campaign. So now's the time, or was this more strategically done, if so why?
I think it was strategic, personally, because, you know, I remember having a conversation about a week before this came up, somehow this subject came up. It was before Biden's statement. And me and this other person said, you know, we bet everything we own that Barack Obama is in favor of same-sex marriage. This whole bit about evolving and all of that, it was political talk, we said. And sure enough, it was. And I think it's something he's doing just to solidify his base. It's kind of it's not a winning move for him, but in the United States, politically, one of the biggest groups that's against same-sex marriage is the African-American community.
Why is that?
Because they're steeped in the church, and they believe church doctrine, literally in many cases. But Barack Obama knows, he can tell from polling, and he kind of knows intuitively that African-American voters are not going to abandon him over this issue. You know, I have a friend who's a religion writer, and he sort of made the joke, you know, for African-Americans, he said they were for don't ask, don't tell, long before the military. You know, and that's, you know, that's pretty much it. So I think Barack Obama decided, well, let's get this issue out of the way, just to solidify, just kind of rally the base a little bit. And it's probably not going to alienate any voters who I would get anyway. And
some of the polls indeed since then have shown that there's been a significant shift in the African-American community, going from about 45% support to 60% support in the wider community, from mid-40s to low 50s. So there's almost a statistical evidence of leadership on an issue there, which is kind of unusual these days.
It's kind of unusual, exactly. And to my friend's point, I think many African Americans kind of in name, and you see the polls in California and North Carolina when you have these constitutional amendments, banning gay marriage, black voters, vote for that. But then when you dig deeper and you talk to people, you go to focus groups, it's much more nuanced, because everyone kind of has the personal experience of knowing gay people. And that mitigates kind of whatever feeling they got from reading the Bible or listening to the ministers.
What about Mitt Romney's liabilities? His Mormon faith has been something that he talked about in 2007 when he was running last time. He tried to make a speech a bit like Obama's race speech that kind of, put this issue to rest. It doesn't seem as though he did with the conservative-based evangelical Christians that make up an important part of the early primary electorate for the Republicans. Is the issue now, do you think, buried, or is it going to continue the similar way? Is it going to be like Reverend Wright for Obama? How's it going to play out?
I think he's through the danger zone with that. I think the danger zone for him is the Republican primary campaign, because that's where religiosity kind of comes more to the fore in politics. Now that they've slipped through, I remember once, just a side point, talking to George W. Bush about Mitt Romney back in, this must have been 2007, and he was kind of speculating about people who come up. And we talked about Mormonism, and the former president said that many evangelicals view Mormonism as a cult. Yeah. That sort of thing. And that's something, and the evangelicals are heavily Republican. So I think Romney's made it through that, and now in the general election campaign, I don't think there's anyone who's going to invoke that. I don't see the Democratic forces doing that to the degree that the conservatives have not rallied around Romney. I don't think they'll be trying to actively undercut him. So I think that issue is going to be dormant.
Some would suggest there's always the option for evangelicals to stay at home, and they've been known to do that if they haven't liked the look of a candidate. In Romney's case, if people start to think of the implications of having somebody who, a lot of people, like Reverend Jeffress in Texas famously said, this guy's a member of a cult. Do we want the Commander-in-Chief to be a non-Christian for the first time ever? And you're a member of a cult. I mean, that is potentially a big deal if they don't hate the alternative, another term.
Yeah, but you got to think about the way they frame the alternative, right? I mean, people are still questioning whether Barack Obama was born in the United States. Is he Kenyan? Is he Muslim? God forbid, And so, and a lot of that again resides in the Republican Party. Significant minorities of Republicans believe these things about Barack Obama. So I think whatever qualms they have about Mitt Romney will go away in the face of the opposition. But this campaign is not going to be about, I don't think it's going to be about the right base per se. I think this is a fight for independence. And I think that Mitt Romney has a problem there because he's run away from kind of his independent streak throughout the Republican primary campaign. I think any objective observer would look at Romney's record and say, look at what he did with health care in Massachusetts, even the judges he appointed when he was governor of Massachusetts, and say this is a moderate Republican. The way he ran against Ted Kennedy when he lost the Senate race back in the 1990s, this guy was almost a liberal Republican. But he's run away from all of that. And now to win these independents, who I think will be pivotal in this fall election, he has to kind of come back to the left. And and Romney's pretty talented. Like I said, he'll go right to left and not bat an eye. But this will be a especially deft move if he could pull it off.
One of the complaints you hear from conservatives is that the mainstream media in the United States, pretty much everybody but Fox News, is in the team for Obama. And there is some evidence that suggests that journalists in the United States, certainly the White House Press Corps, tend to personally vote for Democrats more than they do Republicans. There's a famous survey done in the 92 Clinton campaign that said about 80% of the reporters that covered that campaign would have voted for Clinton. There was no evidence that actually proved that they therefore gave him positive coverage as a result, but that's the implication. What do you think of those claims about the mainstream media and what effect it has?
I think there are probably more progressives, more probably Democratic-leaning reporters in the press corps than not. But I don't think that has any effect on the coverage. From what I've seen, reporters are in favor of good stories. We're in favor of controversy. We're in favor of being praised by editors. We're in favor of getting raises for doing good stories. So I don't think it plays out where I voted for this guy, so I'm gonna somehow tilt the coverage. And in any case, and particularly these days, it's harder and harder to do so because everything's become so transparent. Press conferences are on TV. There are all kinds of platforms, blogs, and everything else out there that are offering a take on a lot of the events that journalists are covering. So I don't see this, this alleged bias playing out. Now on the right, I think it's different. I think Fox News it's not that, I don't know what Fox News reporters, I don't even know what I don't even know if they'll be necessarily all conservative voters, but it clearly is a business model there to favor the Republicans, and it's been a successful one. So.
In Washington, it seems that you have the White House press corps, and then you have the blogosphere, and you have the people that haven't got the credentials to the White House, and everybody is now kind of connected into what each other is thinking before their deadline is met because they're seeing what each other are tweeting.
Right.
How is this affecting the news gathering process? Is it turning the news cycle from 24 hours into about 30 seconds? Because it certainly seems as though you watch a presidential debate these days, and you're seeing the story being presented and the groupthink kind of spreading across the room.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and not only that, I think the newsmakers have a way of kind of monitoring how the message is playing, and they can kind of alter it, through the kind of the normal news cycle. So the news cycle is in a strange way compressed and endless all at the same time. It's like a constantly moving target. I think, who was it? Hillary Rosen, Democratic consultant, when she made the comment about Ann Romney, Mitt Romney's wife, never working a day in her life, it immediately became kind of a thing, that was tweeted out. Ann Romney tweeted out her kind of objection. The White House tried to distance themselves from it. Had Michelle Obama tweet out that, a woman who raises children is working hard. And this all happened within a matter of hours before, and there were newspaper stories up before the first newspaper was printed, or before the first evening newscast. So Twitter and things like that allows for kind of, candidates to kind of adjust their message and fine-tune their message, and it allows news outlets to sort of, respond quickly to one another.
I mean, does that concern you as a newspaper man, principally, that stories being generated by a comment made on, I think it was Piers Morgan on CNN, where Hillary Rosen made those comments, and it becomes this whole thing that almost goes straight from panel comment to, it's now being discussed with the All-Star panel on Hannity's show over on Fox about half an hour later.
Right. I mean, it's a real problem. I think, because journalism now is almost done on two levels. When I was at the White House, and one of the reasons I wanted to kind of get out of that beat is you got caught in what I call the noise all the time. What are they talking about on cable television? What's being tweeted? I've had instances where I'd be at a White House briefing when Robert Gibbs was Obama's press secretary, and Robert Gibbs would make a joke, a literal joke, and someone would maybe tweet about it, or blog about it, live blog about it. My editors would email me and say, can we do a little item on this? Because we want to be kind of in the buzz. We want to be in the conversation. That's a big sort of buzzword around the newsroom. So we kind of are working on two levels. You're kind of working in an instantaneous market. You want to be kind of in everyone's conversation. But at the same time, you're working for that next day story, for the deeper story. So you kind of have to separate the noise from what I would consider to be our more important work. But you can't ignore the noise, because that's where we feel like that's where the future is, and we don't know. We're so insecure about our future. We don't want to forego any clicks on the internet, even if we know it's silliness.
That little part of the homepage of any news site that says most read stories that are usually involving Kim Kardashian.
We used to say you can get Paris Hilton, Sarah Palin, and Kim Kardashian into the same sentence. You have the best read,
So
story.
What is that doing to? Because electronic media essentially gave up employing real journalists rather than reporters a long time ago. We kind of accepted that newspapers would initiate stories. We'd open the newspaper and then do an interview based on that. That's why it's been released for years, to my knowledge. We are seeing less and less newspaper journalists. We're seeing less and less newspapers.
Yeah.
You happen to be one of the big ones that
Small one.
Yeah, small, but it has a future. You would think as a brand, even if it's delivered electronically rather than in newsprint. When you're doing your daily workflow and you're working on feature pieces, but you're also working on those stories triggered by a tweet, how do you manage those constraints?
It's hard. It's kind of a continuous juggling act. When I was at the White House, you kind of try to divide your day in a way. You spend the first part of your day where you kind of plan what you're going to do for your newspaper story, but then that might be the first hour or two. You send a budget line into the editor. Then after that, you're just kind of in tennis mode. You're kind of volleying all this stuff that's flying around the internet, you know, and you decide what you're going to respond to. You do little 2-graph hits, 3-paragraph hits, and that sort of thing. One thing we did at the White House, there were 3 of us who rotated on the beat. So we'd have duty days. So, you know, one person this day is in charge of kind of, you know, what we would say is, you know, the crap. You know, you deal with most of this, even though everyone ends up pitching in. But you also have to consciously kind of, you know, extricate yourself from that to do, you know, what I consider to be the important work. Because so much of what is flying around is just, it's almost an echo chamber type stuff, you know. And I think the challenge for us, and I think our real value added is, you know, the authority and plus bringing new ideas, new facts to the conversation, not just being part of the conversation.
I guess for most journalists, the idea of being a White House correspondent is probably about the most glamorous posting you can get. What can you tell us about that you couldn't know unless you'd been got your credentials, you're in the conference briefing with Gibbs?
First I'll tell you a piece of wisdom that I got from a former White House correspondent before I took the job. He called it the best job in journalism to have had. and I kind of understood what he meant once I'd done it for a few years. I mean, it's a great job. You get to see the mechanism of the presidency at work. You get to see kind of history unfold. But it's a different style of journalism than I'm used to. It's really access journalism. You know, you have to have someone tell you stuff. There's not really a way to observe that much or to use documents to prove stuff. You know, you're kind of like dependent on, you know, what Robert Gibbs tells you, or if you're even doing some kind of enterprise story, to get someone from the White House to talk to you, you have about 6, 7, 8, 9 portals. You know, you have to put your request in with X person. You can't roam the White House. You know, there's a press room and it's very claustrophobic. You know, you sit there in this little chair. We have a tiny desk in the back, and there's no. You can't just. You can go to Gibbs's office, but that's it. The door is closed like 3/4 of the time. You know, so there's that. When you're on the road, you're traveling in motorcades or on a press bus. You could be in a motorcade. I've had instances where something breaks on the web. I'm sitting in a van in a motorcade, like, you know, 20 yards from the president's limousine, and I might as well be in another state, you know, because you're not going to get a response. So it's a kind of confining job in that way, but at the same time it's wondrous because you get to see the world, and again you get to see, you know, what we Americans call the most powerful man in the world up close, and you get to know him a little bit on a personal level. That
access, is there a price that you pay? Some people say that the whole thing is structured around subtly pressuring White House correspondents to side with the administration, because if they write too much that's negative, they're never going to get that sit down with the president. They're never going to get the one-on-one, etc. So there's a little bit like working for a powerful media proprietor. You self-censor, even if you know nobody's making you do it.
I don't think that really happens much. I mean, because there's still a certain swag that, say, a Washington Post has. They have to talk to you. They have to talk to the New York Times. They still have to talk to the networks. I mean, it's not as much as it used to be in the old gatekeeper era. Because now they leak stuff to anybody because, you know, because it'll get out there and we'll have to respond to it. But I don't think any journalist worth his salt is going to soften his message in hopes of getting an interview with the president. Because they give those interviews out very strategically. They know what they're doing. Usually it's to place their message. It's not really in response to you. So, you know, that wouldn't work even if, you know.
On the other side of how competitive is it? There was a spat in the White House briefing room today. Jake Tapper was being castigated by a guy, I think, from CBS Radio for asking 5 questions in a row. He sort of said, you know, Jake, get an interview. You know, you're dominating. Is there a pecking order? You know, are there people that get called on and you kind of, you know, barter over that?
It's interesting. In the briefing room, you know, you have assigned seats, and it kind of goes almost with kind of the perceived prestige of your news outlet. You know, so the Washington Post, like the broadcast networks, are up front along with the wire services. And, you know, the Washington Post is in the second row next to the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. And in the back are the small regional papers. And there's a surprising number of gadflies who come to these briefings every day. You know, but everyone has different needs. Like as a newspaper reporter, I didn't really need to have my questions answered on camera. You know, you could kind of glean from what Jake's doing. You know, you emailed questions in to people earlier. You know, you talk to your sources, you know, mostly via email these days. And you kind of can gather your stuff in so many other ways. But for a broadcast journalist, you know, you want to be seen on camera asking that question. So I think it's a little more contentious for the broadcast types. The newspaper types, we'd often sit at these briefings and you're just kind of waiting it out, like you need to get back to your work because these things are, tend to be vacuous and the questions are repetitive, and certainly the answers aren't enlightening.
All right. Well, thank you for your enlightening answers thus far. And now's, I think, a good opportunity for you all to ask some questions. Well, I think we've got a roaming mic, unless we've actually got the roaming mic.
We have the roamers.
But if you want to grab my one, perhaps, I can see some.
My name is Louise, I'm a postgraduate student with the US Studies Centre. I'm just curious, this is a bit left of centre, the Occupy Wall Street movement got a lot of coverage here, but it seems to have gone quiet. Do you think it's going to have any impact on the election in November, and whether we would assume that they would be Democrat voters? Do you think that that's going to have an influence?
I think it's had an effect already in terms of putting this issue of inequality on the table. But the thing is, I don't think that the Democrats even are in a strong position to capitalize on and mobilize many people around it because they're a little reluctant to sort of embrace this idea of going after the 1%. You know, Barack Obama has talked about, changing the tax structure, taxing millionaires more and things like that. But Occupy, I think, has kind of the feel to many Americans as a movement that raised a good issue, but was really peopled by professional protesters, not the quote-unquote the people. So I think it raised this issue of inequality, but I don't think it's become kind of a mass movement or anything like that will impact the election.
Hi, I'm Ksenia Belisova from Georgetown University. So John, you mentioned the importance of mood and that people don't feel like the recession's over. And Michael, you noted that people are supportive of the parts of Obamacare, but not the whole thing. So to me, it seems like people just don't actually know. So it's like a problem of voter information. And just from like an Australian perspective, I feel like compulsory voting really helps with that, and that it turns the task into conversion rather than just getting out the vote. So do you think that that's, I don't know, viable in the States?
Compulsory health care is not even viable. I'd say no.
Yeah, I mean, that's a discussion. Just quickly, that's a discussion I've had with a lot of people, and even people quite far on the left in the United States. You want to get these hot-button social issues out of the political realm. Just make it compulsory voting, or just compulsory turning up, getting your name marked off, don't even have to vote. And as Mike says, they won't wear it. To us, it makes all the sense in the world. But it's one of those things that, interestingly, Norm Ornstead and Tom Mann, that have just written a book from the AEI and Brookings, one of their recommendations for how they can fix the current gridlock in Congress is compulsory voting. So they're looking at it, at least at the kind of think tanky measures.
Hi, I'm Eugene, postgraduate student here. I was wondering, I read a David Frum column a few weeks ago in the New York Magazine about what's happened to the Republican Party, and he was talking about how they essentially live in their alternative reality with their own media, their own facts, their own narratives, and you see it happening on the left as well. Is that a real issue for politics and for you in the media as well? Talking to a smaller group of people.
Yeah, I think that's really the case, and that's been one of maybe the downsides of kind of the new media, if you will. Everyone can kind of self-select. People can reinforce their notions by going to the website that they like, by going to the news source that they like. We can't even agree on the facts anymore. We can't even agree on what the problem is, never mind the solution. So I think that's a problem, and I actually think, though, that it's, and this may be controversial, but I think it's actually more of an issue on the right, in the sense that I think there's more of a kind of unified ideology than on the left. And I think you can just look at the popularity of Fox News. I think that says something about kind of where people MSNBC tries to do the same thing on the left in the United States, but it doesn't have the same punch.
Got a question up there?
Yes.
Welcome to the country that brought you the man who brought you Fox News. I want to ask you a question as a representative, obviously, of the press here. You're representing to us everybody in the press in the U.S., as well as the Washington Post. It has to do with what you might call moral equality, or just equality, to pick up on the prior question. When there are issues which a news person, a media person, such as you or your colleague, where there is the arguments are not equal or don't have equal weight. Of course, that's where the argument is. But how much is it important in the press, especially if you're being labeled as a liberal newspaper, as yours is? How important is it for you, or what emphasis do you put on showing them equally? Or at what point do you call out the one who seems to be more on the hurtful side or the negative side rather than the one on the positive side? Or do we have to just live with this moral equality?
You just put your finger on one of the things that I wrestle with a lot in journalism, and I think all journalists do. There's this pressure, I think, to at least present both sides, and to sort of present both sides honestly, not just to put one side out there, just sort of a name only and then explain the other. But I think you do reach a point, it depends on the issue. If you get into things like, just the other day I saw Donald Trump once again talking about the president's birth certificate. And I think we've reached a point now where we're not debating that. Right? We're saying, Donald Trump, you're crazy. Move on. But that's a kind of unique issue. I remember back when I was still at the White House, maybe it was it must have been in the fall of 2009 when kids were coming back to school. And the president was going to go make a speech from a school. Basically, a speech saying kids need to study hard and this and that. Nothing policy-wise, nothing that you consider to be controversial. A press release was done by the head of the Florida Republican Party saying that the President of the United States wants to indoctrinate school children into, his, liberal ways. And it's the kind of thing that in the days of the old media, when you had a trash can next to your desk and create press releases on paper, you would toss that into the trash can. But that story, we ignored it at the Post for a couple of days, but it kind of got going in alternative media, got going in right-wing media. And we ended up doing a couple of stories about the president's upcoming speech at an elementary school to tell children to study hard. It was a controversial thing. Will he indoctrinate the kids? And we had to look back, and we looked back at former presidents. George Bush, the first George Bush president, did the same thing. But interestingly, there were a couple of mentions and a couple of stories where Democrats were complaining about that, but it didn't take on the life that this thing did. There was cable TV chatter all day. So, that's the kind of thing you're talking about. But I think we probably err on this. I know our editor, Marcus Broccoli, who came from the Wall Street Journal, he left a year after Rupert Murdoch took over. He's a very big stickler he thinks it enhances our credibility to take all arguments seriously unless they reach that ridiculous level. And where that line is kind of a tough thing to gauge, but, Donald Trump has crossed it at least.
Supplementary on that while we get ready for our next question and pass the mic around. You talked earlier about the media's bias being in part a bias towards conflict. Because there is that point of the false equivalency, climate change being the most often cited example of where the deniers are given equal weight. How much are journalists they're just looking for a fight here, and they're very happy to boost up the negative because
it makes for a better story. It's going to be on the front page, not on page 4.
I like to think most of us like to be intellectually honest, about these things. But also there's some, I think you get sucked into it because other people report it the other way. And if you don't, people criticize you. So it kind of...
You buried the lead here.
Yeah, exactly. So we do that. But we kind of more like conflict between people and conflict among, the political combatants, that sort of thing. So, but there is some of that. If you're going to write a story about climate change, I don't think anyone's going to do it without including the point of view of a denier. And that's kind of the reality of it. And I think part of it is because in the United States there's so many policymakers, so many lawmakers who don't believe this. And I guess maybe you have to lend, you have to lend legitimacy to that a little bit.
Another question?
Just quickly, who do you think Mitt Romney will choose as his running mate?
My money is on Rob Portman, a guy you probably haven't heard of, the senator. He's a senator from Ohio. Kind of low-key, uncharismatic. The one thing about him that may hurt him, he was George W. Bush's budget director for 1 year. But it wasn't his fault. But that would be my guess, because I think you would kind of present then kind of a fiscal front, the businessman and the budget guy. We're not going for flash, no game changers this time, no need for Mama Grizzlies. We'll just, kind of go 3 yards on a cloud of dust, to use an American football metaphor.
So that's the reinforce the message of a candidate with a VP that kind of represents what they represent. It's the Clinton-Gore model rather than the make up for the lack of charisma of the flash guy.
Everybody, trying to close the gender gap with a woman, it's that sort of thing. But I'll warn you that I'm always wrong about these things. So.
That's right. And that sticker there, that shows how good I am at picking. So that's maybe in 2016. Another question?
Hi. I heard last year that the primary news source for Americans aged 18 to 30 was The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I just wondered, how much influence do you think those comedy news programs really have on voters' ideas and, interpretations of current events?
I think they're huge. I think, particularly for young folks, I know I look at my own kids. I have 2 children in their 20s, and that's part of where they get their news. They watch The Daily Show and Colbert more than they would say watch, certainly the network evening newscasts and perhaps even CNN. So I think they have a huge influence. And oddly, even though they're doing comedy, they don't do a bad job. Like all that lampooning and stuff. I mean, there are a lot of facts woven in there. I watch sometimes, not that often. And clearly, you can tell by the policymakers who turn up on the show. People love that. And I'll tell you what, I've written a book once, and our agent was trying hard to get on. I guess it was The Daily Show, because we know that's where kind of an engaged audience is.
It's like Oprah's book club.
Yeah, not that good, but close.
Just about. Another question? Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, you talked about reporting on things like deniers and giving, essentially it gives them credibility when you do report on it. So do you and your colleagues find yourselves reporting on these issues that you really don't give much credence to, and then sort of talk amongst yourselves and go, we're kind of part of the problem?
Well, no, I think when we do that, we try to point out that, whatever the percentage is, I don't know a lot about climate change, of scientists who believe in climate change is overwhelming. We always try to, frame it to say, this is a minority view, or, things like that. You want to be honest. It's not just that you want to stir up conflict. You do want to have some intellectual honesty. But you at the same time, you want to acknowledge that it's not 100%, you know what I mean? And it's not even 1%. And I don't know if it's 8 or whatever the number is of, the percentage of scientists who don't believe. So, so we try to be honest, but I think if we had our way, maybe a lot of things wouldn't get in. But when we do include that sort of thing, we try to talk about what the consensus is as well, just so as not to give it undue weight.
Got a question? Do you want to shout it out, maybe?
Yep. So, how about the wider issue of the extent to which the job of governing the US, the job of being US president, has become impossible in this era because of the overweening power of the Fourth Estate. What's your take on that?
I don't think we're the problem at all. I really don't. I mean, you look back to American history, there's been raucous eras of, of the press. We're kind of re-entering what used to exist before, in the prior century. You go back 100 years. I think what's happened is that, it's probably no other way to say it, like the Republican Party has become really dug in our country. And it's become very unified, and a lot's changed. Both parties have, and this sort of art of compromise has gone away. I don't think the media has caused that. I think it has something to do with how our electoral districts are drawn, particularly in the House of Representatives. People are living with more like-minded people. There aren't as many districts where you have kind of a diversity of ideas, so the representatives can afford to be, pig-headed about things. And I think that's part of what drives it, And these days, I think a lot of politicians, they circumvent us in many ways. There's so many, in a sense, that we don't have, we at the Washington Post don't have control. John and I were talking, about the lack of staff on cable news stations, and you're hearing us talk about the need to feed the internet beast. Now, when a press secretary puts out a press release, it's almost never ignored because we need to keep stuff coming. So I think it gives kind of more power to their messaging. There's less gatekeeping, So I think all of that has made it easier for these guys to be more dug in. So I think that's the problem. I don't think it's really us, but maybe maybe you're right.
That's sort of part of what I'm alluding to.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that, for instance, as you said earlier, the White House, to some extent, is obsessed with keeping up with and interacting with the news cycle. Does this mean that it becomes hard for the US government to keep its eye on long-term issues?
No, I mean, I think they do both. They can do both, and I think they feel like they have to engage kind of the noise. It's a couple of people's job to respond to these kinds of things. But I think the long-term problems it really just stem from the political process, absent what the Fourth Estate does. I think it's just their lack of collegiality. I don't know if there's a different kind of civility out here. It would take someone with different kind of credentials than mine to sort of analyze it fully. But you read history and you hear about how intractable problems, segregation, civil rights bill, how a president could, Lyndon Johnson could pull people into a room and basically tell them what to do, and that doesn't exist anymore. But I don't know that things are ungovernable. I remember I grew up in New York City during a time, an era of graffiti over the subway cars, and people used to say, this is an unmanageable city. There are 2,000 murders a year. It's just ungovernable. And that changed. And I believe that the federal system can change too. And I think a lot of it, I blame to some degree also voters. Americans, with all this happening, we talk about compulsory voting, so many people are not engaged. And I think politicians are so easily influenced by engaged voters, by organized voters. And when we saw some of that with the Tea Party movement, whatever you think of the Tea Party movement, I think they moved politics in America, and that's to their credit. It really is. So I think more people need to get engaged, and politicians don't just move one way. They respond to their constituencies. But if 25, 30% of people are voting in a congressional election, they know who their voters are, and they play to that crowd. I think people need to get more involved, and I think things will change.
Okay. One quick question here, and then we're just about out of time.
How do you think Citizens United is going to affect the outcome of this election?
I think that's a huge, huge issue. Citizens United, basically, is a Supreme Court case that allowed for basically unlimited contributions to outside groups to affect elections. And that's played out. That played out in the Scott Walker election. Walker raised tens of millions of dollars. He outspent Barrett 3-1. And already we have ads running in our swing states or battleground states in the United States funded by these outside groups. Some in favor of Obama, some pro Romney. So I think this is a huge thing, and it's the kind of issue that's hard to engage voters on, hard to engage Americans on, to say, well, this is a problem. I remember for a while after the Supreme Court made its ruling, Obama criticized the ruling publicly, which was unusual, and he was criticized for that. And the White House even tried to make kind of an issue of it, but they quickly dropped that because people didn't respond to it. I think it's, you know, it's maybe just too removed for the average voter to engage, but I think it's a big, big thing. The idea of that much money in politics, essentially distorting messages, I think is problematic.
Well, thank you all very much, and would you please take one, please?